The harbor at Saint-Nazaire had been built to endure. Concrete dominated everything. Thick, reinforced slabs stretched across the waterfront, forming one of the most heavily fortified submarine bases in occupied Europe. From the air, it looked almost unnatural. An angular mass of gray, its roof layered in multiple meters of hardened concrete designed specifically to resist bombing. Inside, German U-boats moved in and out of protected pens, shielded from Allied air raids that had already devastated less fortified ports along the Atlantic coast. For the German Navy, this place was not just a harbor. It was a guarantee that even under constant pressure from Allied aircraft, their submarines could be serviced, repaired, and redeployed without interruption. The U-boat campaign depended on facilities like this. Without them, operations in the Atlantic would slow. Convoys would become harder to intercept. The war at sea would shift. That was why the base had been built the way it was. And that was why, for months, Allied bombing had failed to do anything meaningful against it. Bombs fell. Explosions echoed across the harbor. Smoke rose. But when it cleared, the structure remained. The reinforced roof absorbed the impact. Even direct hits from standard aerial bombs did little more than scar the surface. The U-boats beneath stayed protected, untouched by the destruction above. Among British crews, frustration had begun to grow. They could reach the target. They could drop their payloads with increasing accuracy. But they could not break it. And so, a different idea began to circulate. If the problem was penetration, if the bombs were detonating too early, exploding on impact without reaching the structure's vulnerable points, then the solution was not necessarily a larger explosion. It was timing. A bomb that could survive the initial impact. A bomb that could go deeper. The concept was simple. The execution was not. Early prototypes were crude, almost improvised in appearance. Cylindrical shapes, reinforced casings, delayed fuses, designed not for immediate destruction, but for delayed effect. The intention was to allow the bomb to strike, penetrate, and then detonate beneath or within the structure rather than on top of it. To many observers, it did not inspire confidence. The design looked bulky, unrefined, lacking the precision of more conventional munitions. Among some crews, the nickname came quickly. The Dustbin. It wasn't meant as praise. The weapon looked like something thrown together, heavy, awkward, and inelegant. Compared to the sleek lines of standard bombs, it seemed almost primitive. But those who had worked on it understood something others did not. This was not a weapon built for appearance. It was built for a specific problem. And that problem was the U-boat pen at Saint-Nazaire. On a cold night along the English coast, a group of RAF bomber crews gathered near their aircraft, receiving final instructions under dimmed lights. The mission briefing had been unusually focused. The target was clear. The approach route was defined. The risks were understood. But the payload was different. Ground crews had already loaded the new bombs into the aircraft. Even in the low light, their shape stood out longer, heavier, with reinforced casings that gave them a blunt, almost industrial appearance. One of the airmen ran a hand along the surface of the bomb before climbing aboard. "Looks like we're dropping dustbins tonight," someone muttered. A few quiet laughs followed. Not out of confidence. Out of habit. Because humor was often the only way to manage uncertainty before a mission. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was different. Seriously. Focused. The pilot adjusted his controls as the engines warmed, the vibration building steadily through the frame. Behind him, the bomb aimer checked his instruments, running through calculations that would determine the exact release point over the target. Everything depended on timing. If the bomb was released too early, it would miss. Too late, and it might strike at the wrong angle. And even if it hit, there was still the question of whether it would work. The engines roared to full power. One by one, the bombers lifted into the night sky, their silhouettes disappearing into the darkness as they formed up for the long flight across occupied territory. Below them, the coastline faded. Ahead, the Atlantic stretched black and silent. And beyond that, the concrete fortress that had resisted everything thrown at it so far. Inside the aircraft, no one spoke about the nickname anymore. They focused on altitude. Of course. on the steady rhythm of the engines. Because somewhere over that harbor, a weapon that many had dismissed as crude would be tested against one of the strongest structures in the war. And for the first time, the outcome would not be decided on the surface. The French coastline appeared as a faint, jagged shadow beneath the bomber as it crossed inland. From altitude, the land looked quiet, almost untouched. Small clusters of lights flickered in distant towns, carefully dimmed under occupation rules, while the darker shapes of rivers and fields stretched outward into the night. But the closer they moved toward Saint-Nazaire, the more that quiet began to dissolve into something sharper, more deliberate. Defenses. The pilot adjusted the course slightly, following the navigation instructions with precision. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere had tightened. The earlier calm had given way to a focused stillness. Each man locked into his role as the mission moved from transit to execution. Approaching the target zone, the navigator said. The words carried weight. Everyone knew what came next. Below them, the first signs of the harbor began to take shape. The water reflected faint glimmers of light, broken occasionally by darker silhouettes, ships, docks, and the massive structure of the U-boat pens themselves. Then the sky changed. A sudden burst of light erupted off the port side. Flak. It came without warning. Black puffs expanding rapidly in the air, followed by sharp flashes as anti-aircraft shells detonated at altitude. Within seconds, more bursts followed, filling the sky around them with a chaotic pattern of explosions. The German defenses had detected them. Inside the bomber, the sound changed instantly. The steady hum of engines was now layered with the concussive thumps of nearby detonations, each one sending a subtle shockwave through the aircraft's frame. Flak heavy, the co-pilot said. The pilot held his course. Evasive maneuvers at this stage would compromise the bombing run. They had to stay steady long enough to reach the release point. Below, searchlights snapped on. Thin beams of white light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the sky in coordinated arcs. One beam passed just behind the bomber, then another crossed ahead. Within seconds, the sky was filled with them, crisscrossing, searching, trying to lock onto the incoming aircraft. Keep low drift, the navigator instructed. The pilot adjusted slightly, keeping the aircraft within the planned approach corridor. Inside the nose section, the bomb aimer lay prone, his eyes fixed through the sight. The harbor was now fully visible beneath him, the docks, the water, and dominating everything, the U-boat pen. Even from above, it looked massive. A solid block of reinforced concrete, its roof layered and thick, designed to absorb punishment that would destroy ordinary structures. Around it, smaller buildings showed signs of previous bombing, craters, damaged walls, scorched areas where explosions had struck. But the pen itself remained intact, untouched where it mattered. The bomb aimer adjusted his view slightly, aligning the sight with the structure. Target in view, he said calmly. Behind him, the bomb bay doors opened. Cold air rushed through the aircraft, carrying with it the distant echo of explosions and the rising intensity of the flak barrage. The Dustbin bomb sat in place, secured until the moment of release. Heavy, unassuming. Its reinforced casing was designed not to shatter on impact, but to endure it. Outside, the sky grew more dangerous with every second. Flak bursts closed in, some detonating uncomfortably close, rocking the aircraft with sudden jolts. One explosion flashed just below the wing, fragments rattling against the fuselage like hard rain. Still, the pilot held steady. They had seconds. No more. The bomb aimer adjusted again, fine-tuning the alignment as the aircraft moved into the final approach. The angle had to be exact. The timing had to be perfect. The bomb needed to strike the structure at the right point with the right momentum to penetrate before detonation. Too early, it would explode on the surface. Too late, it would miss entirely. Steady, steady? His voice remained calm, but every man on board could feel the tension behind it. The U-boat pen filled his view now. Closer, larger, immovable. The structure that had resisted everything thrown at it so far. Another flak burst exploded nearby, the shockwave rippling through the aircraft. The pilot tightened his grip on the controls but did not deviate. Hold it, the bomb aimer said. The moment stretched. The entire aircraft seemed to narrow into a single line of movement, straight toward the target, through fire, through light, through the chaos of the defenses below. Stand by. The bomb bay vibrated slightly as the mechanism prepared to release. Below, the concrete roof of the pen loomed closer, its surface scarred but unbroken. Now, the release switch was triggered. The bomb dropped. For a fraction of a second, it remained visible beneath the aircraft. Then it disappeared into the darkness below, falling toward the structure that had defied every previous attempt to destroy it. Inside the bomber, no one spoke. The pilot immediately began to bank away, turning the aircraft out of the direct line of fire as the flak continued to burst around them. But below, the outcome was already in motion. The bomb fell fast, its weight pulling it downward with increasing speed. No guidance, no correction, just gravity, momentum, and design. It struck the roof of the U-boat pen with tremendous force, and instead of exploding on impact, it vanished into the concrete. For a moment after impact, nothing happened. From above, the bomber crew could not see it clearly. The aircraft had already begun its banking turn, pulling away from the target zone as flak continued to burst around them. The U-boat pen disappeared partially beneath drifting smoke and darkness, its massive shape fading into the chaos below. But inside the structure, everything had changed. The bomb had not exploded on the surface. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. Driven by its weight and reinforced casing, it punched through the upper layers of concrete, tearing past the outer slab and forcing its way into the deeper structure. The impact sent shockwaves through the roof, cracks spidering outward from the entry point as the bomb continued downward, its momentum carrying it into the internal layers that had never been breached before. Then it stopped, buried within the structure, hidden, waiting. Inside the pen, German personnel reacted instantly to the impact. The sound alone, deep, violent, and unlike the sharp detonations of previous bombings, echoed through the interior space like a contained thunderclap. Dust fell from the ceiling in thin streams, drifting down onto the decks and machinery below. Some looked upward. Others froze where they stood. Because this was different. Bombs had struck the roof before. They had heard those impacts many times. The explosions always came immediately, loud, violent, but ultimately contained by the thickness of the concrete above. This time, there was no explosion. Only the sound of something hitting, and then silence. A few seconds passed. Confusion spread. One of the officers shouted an order, his voice cutting through the stillness as he tried to assess what had happened. The assumption at first was simple: the bomb had failed. Another impact absorbed by the structure, another attempt that would leave only superficial damage. That belief lasted just long enough. Then the detonation came. It began as a low, internal pressure, almost a deep vibration felt more than heard. Then, in an instant, it expanded into a violent explosion contained within the structure itself. The effect was catastrophic, because the blast did not strike from above, came from inside. The reinforced concrete, designed to resist external force, had not been built to withstand an explosion within its own layers. The pressure had nowhere to disperse outward cleanly. Instead, it forced its way through the internal structure, cracking, splitting, and displacing massive sections of material. The roof above the impact point fractured, not superficially, but structurally. A section of reinforced concrete, thick, layered, and previously considered impenetrable, shifted under the force. Cracks widened instantly, spreading outward in jagged lines. Segments of the roof began to separate, their weight no longer fully supported. Inside the pen, the explosion tore through confined space. Machinery was thrown violently. Lights shattered. Dust and debris filled the air, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Men were knocked to the ground by the force, disoriented by the sudden shift from silence to overwhelming noise and pressure. And above them, the structure began to fail. From the outside, the effect was visible seconds later. A section of the U-boat pen's roof bulged slightly, then cracked open along the lines created by the internal blast. Pieces of concrete, some weighing tons, shifted and broke apart, collapsing inward as the structural integrity of that section gave way. Smoke burst outward from the opening, followed by a cascade of debris falling into the interior space. For the first time since its construction, the pen had been breached. Not scratched, not scared, but it opened. Back in the air, the bomber crew saw it as they turned away. At first, it was just a change in the pattern of smoke rising from the harbor. Then, as the aircraft gained distance, the difference became clear. The roof was no longer intact. A section had collapsed inward, creating a visible break in the otherwise solid structure. Direct hit, the bomb aimer said quietly. There was no celebration. Not yet. Just recognition. Because what they were seeing had not happened before. Below, the German response shifted from defense to reaction. Alarms sounded within the base. Personnel moved quickly. Some toward the damaged section, others away from it as the risk of further collapse became clear. Fires began to spread in localized areas, fed by damaged equipment and ruptured systems within the pen. The protected space, the guarantee of safety, had been compromised. For months, the structure had held against everything. Now it had been broken from within. And the weapon that had done it, the one that had been dismissed as crude, oversized, inelegant, had succeeded precisely because it had ignored the rules that conventional bombs followed. It had not tried to destroy the fortress from the outside. It had gone inside and forced the structure to fail itself. By the time the smoke began to thin over Saint-Nazaire, the scale of what had happened was no longer in question. From the outside, the U-boat pen still stood. Its massive concrete form remained largely intact, its outer walls unbroken, its silhouette still dominating the harbor as it always had. To a distant observer, it might have seemed like just another night of bombing, another series of impacts that had failed to bring the structure down. But inside, the reality was very different. The section of the roof that had collapsed inward had created more than just physical damage. It had broken something far more important, the certainty that the structure could not be penetrated. The carefully engineered layers of reinforced concrete, designed to absorb and disperse explosive force, had been compromised in a way they were never intended to withstand. The explosion had not simply cracked the surface. It had disrupted the internal integrity of the pen. Engineers and officers moved quickly through the damaged section, their boots crunching over debris and fractured concrete as they assessed the extent of the destruction. Dust still hung in the air, illuminated by temporary lighting brought in to replace shattered fixtures. Sections of the ceiling showed visible stress fractures, lines running outward from the impact point like veins through stone. And beneath those cracks, uncertainty. Because the damage was not isolated. The internal blast had transmitted force through the structure in unpredictable ways. Supporting sections that had not been directly struck now showed signs of weakness. Reinforcement layers had shifted. Load distribution, carefully calculated during construction, had been altered, which meant one thing. The pen was no longer guaranteed to hold. One officer stood near the edge of the collapsed section, looking upward at the exposed opening where the bomb had entered. The night sky was visible through it now, a narrow, jagged break in what had once been an unbroken shield of concrete. For months, that roof had represented safety. Now it represents vulnerability. Das ist nicht möglich. One of the engineers muttered quietly, but it was. And the implications spread quickly. Orders were issued to clear certain sections of the pen, relocating equipment and personnel away from the damaged area. U-boats scheduled for maintenance were redirected where possible, and additional precautions were implemented immediately, because the assumption had changed. Before, the pen had been considered secure against aerial attack. Now it was not. That shift moved upward through the chain of command with urgency. Reports were compiled, damage assessments forwarded, and within hours, higher-level officers were reviewing the situation with a level of concern that had not existed before. The structure had not been destroyed, but it had been compromised. And in warfare, that distinction mattered. Because once a defensive system proves vulnerable, it can be targeted again, improved upon, repeated. The question was no longer whether the Allies could penetrate the pen. It was how often they could do it. Meanwhile, along the harbor, the visible effects of the strike continued to develop. Smoke drifted steadily from the damaged section, and small fires burned within areas where equipment had been damaged or destroyed. Crews worked to contain them, but the disruption to normal operations was clear. The pen still functioned, but not as it had before. Above, the sky had returned to relative quiet. The bombers had long since departed, their silhouettes gone beyond the horizon. The flak guns that had filled the night with explosions now stood silent again. Their crews left with the knowledge that, despite their efforts, something had slipped through, something new, something they had not been prepared for. Back in Britain, the returning aircraft touched down one by one, their crews stepping out into the early morning light with the same controlled composure they had carried into the mission. There were no immediate celebrations. Missions like this were rarely judged at the moment. The real outcome would come from reconnaissance, from photographs, from confirmation. But among the crews, there was already a quiet understanding. The target had been different this time, and so had the weapon. The nickname, the Dustbin, had not come up again, because what mattered now was not how it looked, but what it had done. In planning rooms and engineering offices, the implications were already being considered. If one such bomb could penetrate the structure, then adjustments could be made. Refinements developed. Delivery improved. The principle had been proven, and that was enough to change the approach entirely. The U-boat pens, once considered untouchable, were no longer beyond reach. Not because they had been weakened, but because the method of attack had evolved. And once that shift occurred, there was no going back. In the days that followed, the harbor at Saint-Nazaire returned to operation, but never to certainty. From a distance, the U-boat pen still looked like what it had always been. A massive block of reinforced concrete, dominating the shoreline with the same imposing presence that had defined it since its construction. Ships still moved in the surrounding waters. Crews still worked along the docks. Repairs were made, debris cleared, and the visible damage reduced wherever possible. But the illusion of invulnerability was gone. The breach in the roof could be patched. Cracks could be reinforced. Sections could be stabilized. What could not be restored was the belief that the structure could withstand anything. Inside the pen, that change was felt more than seen. Every movement beneath the damaged section carried a new awareness. Every sound, metal shifting, distant vibrations, even routine operations now carried a different weight. The concrete overhead was no longer just protection. It was a question. Engineers worked continuously, assessing structural stress, reinforcing weakened areas, and trying to determine how far the internal damage had spread. But the truth was difficult to measure. The bomb had not simply broken through, it had disrupted the internal balance of the structure in ways that could not be fully mapped. And that uncertainty affected everything. U-boat crews preparing for deployment now did so under conditions that no longer felt controlled. The pen had been their shield, a place where they could operate without fear of sudden destruction from above. Now, that assumption has been replaced by something less stable: doubt. Above them, the sky was no longer just distant. It was a threat again. On the Allied side, reconnaissance confirmed what the returning crews had only glimpsed in the moment. The pen had been penetrated. Photographs revealed the damaged section clearly, a break in the reinforced roof where the structure had failed under internal pressure. The result was not total destruction, but it was something far more valuable. Proof. Proof that hardened targets could be breached. Proof that design, not just force, could overcome even the strongest defenses. And proof that the weapon, once dismissed for its crude appearance, had succeeded where others had not. In engineering rooms, the implications were immediate. The concept worked. A bomb that could penetrate before detonation changed the entire equation of aerial warfare against fortified structures. It meant that targets previously considered immune could now be attacked with purpose rather than persistence. It meant fewer wasted missions, fewer ineffective strikes, and a new direction for weapon development. The Dustbin bomb, as it had been mockingly called, was no longer seen as crude. It was seen as correct, because it had addressed the problem at its core. Not by increasing explosive force blindly, but by understanding where that force needed to be applied. For the crews who had flown the mission, the shift was quieter. There were no dramatic announcements. No immediate recognition beyond internal reports and operational briefings. But among them, the change in perception was clear. They had carried something different. And it worked. Not because it looked advanced. Not because it followed established design. But because it had been built for a specific purpose, and used exactly as intended. Back over the Atlantic coast, the war continued. Other targets remained. Other fortifications stood. But the lesson of Saint-Nazaire had already begun to spread through both sides of the conflict. Structures could no longer rely solely on thickness. Defense could no longer assume that resistance from above would hold indefinitely. And attackers would no longer approach such targets with the same methods. Because something fundamental had shifted. The idea that some positions were simply too strong to break had been tested, and found to be incomplete. The U-boat pen had not been destroyed, but it had been opened. And in war, that was often enough. Far out at sea, beyond the reach of the harbor's defenses, the same waters continued to move as they always had. Silent, constant, indifferent. But beneath that surface, the balance of the conflict had changed slightly. Not through overwhelming force. Not through sheer volume, but through precision, through adaptation, and through a weapon that had been underestimated, until the moment it proved exactly what it was capable of. The name it had been given no longer mattered, because after that night, no one who understood its effect would call it a dustbin again.